Hello and welcome to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And on today's episode, we are returning to the Tudor period to find out about the Duke of Northumberland, but not the one you might expect. When the Percy Earl of Northumberland was confiscated by the crown in the reign of Henry VIII, another family was rising in stature, the Dudleys. And by the time Henry's son was king, it was the Dudleys who held the Northumberland title as well as Alnwick Castle.
To find out more about the rise and fall of this fascinating family, we spoke to Dr Joanne Paul, author of The House of Dudley, A New History of Tudor England. A book of the year for 2022, according to The Times, Sunday Times, Daily Telegraph, and History Today. It's a compelling and immersive look into the fortunes of the Dudleys, from their climb up the social ladder to their varying degrees of influence with the monarchs of the Tudor dynasty. We both highly recommend it.
Here's our conversation with Dr Joanne. We hope you enjoy it.
We are very happy to be joined on this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast by the author of The House of Dudley, Dr Joanne Paul. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I'm good. I wish I was there with you at Alnwick Castle, but one day, hopefully one day.
Yeah, it's a good day here today. It's nice. The sun is out. There are fewer armed men than there might have been in the time of the Dudleys when they were up here for a little bit.
Yeah, I assume it's better provisioned as well. From the letters I've read, there weren't little cakes or snacks at the cafe. So
I think we can probably confirm there were not.
No.
Yeah.
There are now, yes. Please come to our cafe. Congratulations on the book, The House of Dudley. It's been out for a year or two now. We've both read it. We've both really enjoyed it, and there's lots to talk about within there. How did you find the writing of it and how well it was received by everyone?
Oh, that's very kind of you. I mean, I loved writing it. I've written academically before and have enjoyed that as a research project and an exercise in sort of historical detective work. It's good fun. But to write something where I got to flex a bit more of my creative muscles was an absolute joy. And it's such a cliche, write the book you want to read. But I was really doing that. And so it was writing The House of Dudley was like reading the best book for me. It was so much fun. And the process of research was, the Dudleys just kept on giving. I really thought that there would be periods that I'd have to skip over because they just weren't doing much, or it wasn't those highlight moments that we might know about the Dudleys, but actually they were everywhere. And John Dudley's time at Alnwick is a great example of that. In terms of how it's been received, I'm really glad to know that I wasn't the only one who liked this book. Other people have enjoyed it as well, which is wonderful to hear. And I've had some fabulous discussions with people about what in particular struck them or how they felt about some of the figures in the book. It's really interesting. I think I attempted to be pretty neutral in my presentation of most of the Dudleys, at least. And yet I get messages sometimes, or I get tagged in things saying, oh, well, Edmund Dudley deserved everything he got. Just ask Joanne Paul. And I'm going, I didn't write that, but it's very interesting, people's interpretations of how, just really the material that I just present creatively, but without commentary. So that's been fascinating.
And for those who maybe don't know who the Dudleys were, could you just briefly, to start with, tell us a little bit about who they were?
Yeah, so I cover the Tudor Dudleys, which is 3 generations, well, 3.5, there's an epilogue, 3 generations of the Dudley family, who were a sort of minor gentry family at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the Tudor period, and then rise and fall several times through the course of the Tudor period, really even sitting on the throne itself for a very brief period, and also suffering massive falls, executions for treason, and really some of the worst reputations in the Tudor period, and that still persist in some cases today. I try to tell the story of the entire Dudley family. I think there's a tendency sometimes to talk about the three main male figures of the Dudley family. Edmund Dudley, who is quite influential in the reign of Henry VII and is executed by Henry VIII. His son, John Dudley, who rises through the reign of Henry VIII and becomes very, very powerful and influential in the reign of Edward VI, and then is executed by Mary I. And then, of course, Robert Dudley, known as well as the Earl of Leicester, who is a reputed paramour of Elizabeth I. But around them is an entire family and some very impressive and amazing women as well. And so I tried to tell all of their stories as well, best I could, based on the sources.
The start of the book is really interesting for us, particularly at the moment, because we're doing a lot of Wars of the Roses here at the castle. We've been looking into the Percy family and their changing of sides to the Yorkists and rises and falls within that as the Tudor period starts. But the Dudleys had a part in the wars as well, and it was really interesting to read that they weren't just a Tudor family. The Dudleys were starting to have an effect on things a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I didn't have much opportunity to go into this in the book, as I'm sure you're aware. It's not a short book as it is, but I was intrigued to find out that the Dudleys are often associated with this sort of instrumentalist, changing sides, deviousness. And, well, they sort of come by that honestly a little bit. During the Wars of the Roses, Edmund Dudley's grandfather, John Sutton Dudley, was a fairly noted courtier and diplomat, and he had fought alongside Henry I'll always do that, Henry V, alongside Henry V in France, and he'd traveled quite a bit on behalf of the crown. And when the Wars of the Roses kicks off, he fights on behalf of Henry VI, but then when Henry VI is captured, he switches sides and actually joins the court of Edward IV and is constable of the Tower of London, overseeing the imprisonment of Henry VI's queen, who he had, served and fought beside, Margaret of Anjou. So there is a bit of, I guess, scheming, conniving in terms of holding on to power and really protecting oneself and one's family, even a few generations removed from the Tudor Dudleys. And I think that there is a legacy of that that's worth keeping in mind.
It's quite hard to hold on to power at this in English history. There's a lot of falls.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that people talk about the Dudleys as being conniving and scheming and ambitious in a very negative way, but it's worth keeping in mind what the consequences are for falling, and that so much of what they do is really about protecting their family, their children, as well as their brothers and sisters and everything else. And that's what really came through for me, I think, was this sense in which a lot of it was done in order to protect members of the family and the idea of the family.
So it wasn't just that power was their main goal. They were looking at it from the point of view of the Dudleys as a family group.
I think so. I mean, it is an interesting paradox that power seems to be a goal because it brings protection, while at the same time, the higher the rise, the harder the fall. It isn't really protecting them, and if they just lived quietly in the countryside, they'd probably be all right. There's this sort of desperation that comes across sometimes. I mean, I think it depends too who you're talking about. I mean, I think Edmund Dudley, the first of the Tudor Dudleys, has this kind of chip on his shoulder about being from a lesser line of the family and kind of wanting to prove himself, and he dresses in sort of very nouveau riche kind of ways and doesn't make friends and isn't interested in politicking and seems to present himself as almost above it all in a way that I think is overcompensating for his lesser beginnings. But I think if we look at someone like John Dudley, his son, who becomes Duke of Northumberland, we know from some of his letters, he's very invested in the idea of service. He is trying to serve the crown, and I think based on some of his actions, and we can go into those, he is also doing what he does to protect his family and particularly protect his children. And his wife, Jane Dudley, does the same in a way that I found at least very moving, and I know others have as well.
Going back to his title, Duke of Northumberland, people who know Alnwick might know Duke of Northumberland in terms of the Percy family, but they are not the first creation. So how did he become the first Duke of Northumberland?
So he becomes Duke of Northumberland during the reign of Edward VI, just before Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector's arrest. So it's part of the fall of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, Lord Protector, and the rise in his place-ish of John Dudley, who becomes Duke of Northumberland. It's a first creation, as you say. It's something that he creates for himself. I mean, a ducal title, for those who aren't aware, is the highest rank of nobility, usually associated with relatives of the monarch. So it was something pretty impressive to give himself, and he did give it to himself, right? I mean, Edward had to approve it, but it's almost certainly that he went, I'd like to be a duke now, and he is. Why he chose Northumberland, it's hard to say. He did spend time at Alnwick. The Earls of Northumberland at the time were in disgrace. It was sort of a very available title, and he picks it up possibly as a way to show his sort of superiority and to harken back to that time when he was warden in Alnwick. But it was created specifically for him. It's worth noting, though, I think that the title that superseded Earl of Warwick, which then went to his son, was very special to the Dudley family, and the bear and ragged staff becomes such an emblem for them through the generations. So he never kind of, I think, abandons that as something important to him as well.
So it might have been more the being a duke than the Northumberland connection.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll be interested if other people can contribute anything to this as well. But you know, it has to do a lot too with support in the north and having this sense of seats in various places of the country. But certainly when the Dudleys are trying to sort of trace their lineage and their nobility, it's more to do with Warwick than it is to do with Northumberland.
John Dudley does come to Northumberland as a place. You write about it in the book. This is a time when the Percy Earls are not the Lord Warden of the Marches. They've lost pretty much everything after a few rebellions. And he spends time here at the castle and around the borders. What would that have been like at that time? It's after the heyday of the medieval England versus Scotland fighting, but it was still quite a violent place to have to try and look after.
Absolutely. It was violent, it was lawless. It was a time of war. While John Dudley was making his way from London at the head of 500 men to take over as Lord Warden of the Marches from Edward Seymour, actually, who had probably recommended him for the job, he received news of the Battle of Solway Moss, which of course is a very significant battle that takes place between England and Scotland. And throughout, there were all sorts of smaller raids, raiding parties, and a lot of spycraft going on as well, a lot of intelligencing. So as Lord Warden, John was responsible for the defense of the kingdom from raids from the Scottish army, as well as responsible for maintaining law and order in the borderlands, for punishing thieves and murderers and so on, usually with death. But you know, the border laws were pretty sparse. It wasn't an elaborate system of law that you might have in London, for instance. So it was, I think, quite a shock for Dudley to come into that sort of environment. And it was also, there's all the letters that he sends back to London speak about how poorly provisioned it was as well, that already before he arrived, the soldiers who were posted there didn't have enough food, and he was bringing 500 more. The horses were eating rotten food, and they were falling sick and dying, and it was difficult to maintain. But what's quite interesting about his time at Alnwick, it was very significant because it was while he was there that it was him who received the news that James V of Scotland had died and left his 6-day-old daughter as Queen of Scots, who of course Mary, Queen of Scots. And the letters, you can see John working through the information. James V has had a son. No, it isn't a son, it's a daughter, and she's dying. No, she's not dying. At one point he reports her name as Elizabeth. No, it's Mary. And he's just getting this information largely from Scottish captives, as well as from other spies they have at the Scottish court. So he really receives some of the most monumental news to come out of Scotland in the entire Tudor period while he's there at Alnwick.
So quite a lot of these letters have survived, and you've been able to look through them and see the things that he was finding out as they were going on.
Yeah, we're so lucky. We have a lot of those letters preserved in the state papers at the National Archives. A lot of them have been digitized as well, which is very helpful because you can zoom and things like that. Because of course, not only is the handwriting difficult, but many of them have been damaged over time as well. And because he was away from London and reporting back to the Privy Council, there were a lot of letters. Whenever anyone leaves London, you can find out more about what they're up to because they have to write back to the Privy Council. So especially in that period in his life, we have very, very frequent letters. And those ones are fantastic as well because he tends to put his time on them that he's writing them. And so it'll be 3:00 in the morning or midnight or what have you. You know, someone's just ridden in with some information and he writes something off. And he talks too about the attack that they're planning on Scotland to take advantage of this weakened moment. He never gets permission from Henry VIII to actually do it, but he's sort of at the table planning as he's writing these missives back to London. So you can really reconstruct a fantastic image of what his time at Alnwick was like.
So Alnwick wasn't the only property that now is a Percy property that the Dudleys have had a link with. Can you tell us a little bit about Syon House?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about how it intersects with the Dudley story. Certainly, as many people know, it was an abbey that, of course, was part of the dissolution of the monasteries, and it ends up in the hands of Edward Seymour and the Seymour family. And when Seymour falls, Dudley scoops that up as well. And so for a time, it's lived in by the Dudleys. And we know it's properly lived in because, and this is, again, an amazing gift we have from the past, we have the inventory of Syon House when John Dudley is arrested. And it's incredibly detailed. They go room by room and list everything that is in the rooms. So, for instance, we know that John and Jane's chamber, there was an outer chamber for meeting guests and then an inner private chamber. And then we know that it was hung with tapestries, and we know what the tapestries were. There was one of the prodigal son from the Bible. We know that his bed was painted green and silver. We even know his close stool, his toilet, that it was covered in red cloth and discreetly hid a pewter chamber pot. So we have all of these very, very intimate details that allow us to understand what it was like to walk through Syon House when it was owned by the Dudleys. And it's at Syon House, actually, that his daughter-in-law, Jane Grey Dudley, is told that she will be queen after the death of Edward VI. So again, we're able to, when I was writing, I always talked about furnishing a scene. And in this case, we actually have the furnishings. We're able to really recreate what it looked like when the Dudleys lived there. And most of the children had rooms there as well. And again, we have all the description of what that looked like. It's really very fabulous.
One of the things I really like throughout the book is the way that you were able to recreate how these houses and royal palaces would have looked at the time. It made the events that were happening in them so much more vivid. Did you have fun putting those sources together and being able to reimagine a lot of these places that aren't there anymore?
Oh yeah, a great deal of fun. I mean, sometimes it was a headache. And I think I made my life difficult because I demanded of myself that level of detail in each scene that I was creating. And I did think about them as scenes. And so there might have been areas that I wanted to cover, but because I couldn't create that sense of being there, I had to find ways of integrating that information as sort of maybe flashbacks or, information that comes sort of in the context of another scene. But I did love it. There is a slight advantage in terms of working with a family that has been convicted of treason so often because they do inventory their houses. And so I had several inventories to work with because they inventory it all so that they can give it away. And actually the document that inventories Syon has in the margins where it's gone, who's taken it. Most of it goes to the crown, and I think Mary repurposes a lot of it for like the coronation and things. But you can also see the Dudley enemies taking very significant, meaningful objects from Syon House. Like I think it's Norfolk or one of the Howards who ends up with some of the symbols of John Dudley's position, which I think would have been very upsetting for him and a real sort of triumph for the Howards. And so I was really lucky being able to do that. But I did want the reader not just to find out information about the past, but to understand it almost in a visceral sense. And the only way to do that is really to allow them to visualize and enter that scene. And that's both in terms of the setting as well as the emotion of the scene. And I tried to get that across as well.
You mentioned Jane Grey. So how influential was Dudley to get her to become Edward VI's successor?
That's a great question. We don't know is the annoying historian's answer. We don't know. What we have in terms of the establishment of her place in the succession is it's barely more than a note, the device for the succession written by Edward VI, and we have it in his hand. And what's fantastic about this document, and you can find it online and have a look at it, is it's in his hand, and you can see where he's edited it, because originally he invested the succession in Lady Jane's heirs male, so her sons. And then at some point he crosses out the S and adds and her. So it becomes her and her heirs male. And so it doesn't skip her. Originally it skips her and goes to her sons, but she doesn't have any. And he realizes that he's running out of time and so gives it to her. It's in his hand. Was John Dudley standing over him as he wrote it? Maybe. I think that's often the presentation of the scene when we think of it, that it's him sort of intimidating this sickly boy into handing the throne to his daughter-in-law. I think it's worth keeping in mind that Edward was 15. He certainly knew his own mind. If anyone's ever read any letters of his or his journal, he didn't suffer a lack of confidence in himself. And I think it would have been difficult to intimidate him. It might not have been as difficult to manipulate him. And we don't know exactly the sort of relationship they had. The other thing is we don't know in what order events took place. We don't know exactly when he wrote the device or when he edited it. We don't know where that is placed in terms of when Jane Grey married Guilford Dudley, John Dudley's son. So it's difficult to say with any certainty whether John was sort of the maestro in all of that. What we do know is that he defended it and he enforced it as Edward's will and sort of fought with those who argued against it in the court, and then obviously enforced it by riding out in battle against Mary I, a battle that never took place. But yeah, I don't have a proper full answer to that question. It's a great historical mystery. I'd love to know.
Speaking of things we don't know about,
Great.
How did you approach the relationship or not relationship or what was it or what wasn't it between Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley?
As in all things in this book, I tried not to invent anything. I worked from what we knew from the sources. This is going to be a bit of a detour, but I think that imagination always has to be the tool of the historian. It's an essential tool of the historian, whether you're writing the driest of academic tomes or you're writing something much more creative and narrative. You need imagination. I think invention is much more difficult. I think it can have a place, but it's not something I was comfortable with. So everything in the book can be backed up with source material or reports on the weather. The only thing I allowed myself was those things I would consider to be natural. So the sun rises, for instance. The moon is up, and I even looked up phases of the moon and things like that. So it's cold in February. I allowed myself things like that, but I didn't invent anything, and I checked my sources. So, for instance, Robert Dudley claims later in life that he and Elizabeth were very close as children, and that she confided in him that she'd never marry when she was, I think, 7. I felt that was something that had to be taken with a grain of salt and didn't feel comfortable writing that in, for instance, because knowing Robert Dudley as I think I do, I figured he was making it up. And so things like that, they were both in the Tower at the same time. There is no evidence that they met and spent time in the Tower, so I didn't include that. So I tried to be quite fair. What we do know, though, is that they had a very close relationship. We also know about the rumors, and I put those in there because when you get to the Elizabethan period, all you have are rumors, and that is a fair representation of the time. There were a lot of rumors, and I wanted to create that sense of swirling rumor and shadows and people hiding behind rumors and manipulating people through rumors. I don't put a scene in or anything like that where they are intimate. I know that they were affectionate. I know that they did something close to courting. We have the records of his accounts, and we know that they picnicked in St. James's Park, and he was giving her gifts, and they went to Chelsea, and all of this sort of stuff. So that's all in there. But like anything else, I stuck very close to the sources. And what emerges is a beautiful relationship, a fraught one, but a beautiful one. And I think that's enough.
But he was married. So maybe not so much a beautiful relationship on that front.
Yeah, well, it's difficult. It's difficult. So, he marries as a young man. He's just shy of his 17th or 18th birthday. And so is his wife, Amy Robsart. And he is at the court quite a bit in the early years of the reign of Elizabeth I. And there are all these rumors that there is something going on between them. I said courting, but that's almost in a literal sense. That's what you do at court, right? And there is this courtly love tradition that involves a sort of making love to, in the old sense of the term, high-ranking women, and in this case, the Queen, without it meaning that you're being unfaithful to your wife. It's not adultery, So it's difficult, and we don't know how Amy felt about all of this. She was alone a lot, and Robert was at court a lot. But there is a version of this where she's going, "Yeah, you get that, right? You chase that old hubby, you bring it back, And so I think there's so many ways in which the women of the Tudor period get presented as passive victims, and in some sense that's inevitable because they weren't given a lot of power. It's a sexist time, but they did have ways of exerting power and agency, and I hesitate to strip them of that entirely. But what I think we're headed towards is, of course, that in September 1560, she's found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs in fairly mysterious circumstances. And very quickly, the finger of blame is pointed at Robert, though the jury does find it to be a mischance, a mishap, an accident. Robert never fully escapes that, as Cecil calls it, infamy. He is infamed by the death of his wife, Cecil writes. And I think that, although rumors persist for years, I think that really puts the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of any chance of Robert marrying the Queen. He may have murdered his first wife. That's not. Plus, he is the grandson, son, and brother of convicted traitors, and was a convicted traitor himself. So I think it makes him very unlikely as a legitimate suitor to the Queen. I always get asked, do I think that Robert murdered his wife? I don't. I think he was smart enough to know that it wouldn't open a path to marrying the Queen. So if Amy was murdered, I think it was more likely to be someone who didn't want Robert to marry the Queen.
And was the finger pointed at him because people didn't really like him because he was so favoured by the Queen?
Absolutely, absolutely. We know from his accounts that he had commissioned essentially very thin chainmail, almost like a bulletproof vest, to sit underneath his clothes to stop a knife in the dark, essentially, because he was so hated. Oh, which ambassador is it? There's one of the ambassadors says, I don't even think I am paraphrasing. I think these are the exact words. Can no one be found in this country to kill him or to stab him? That they're just so fed up with Robert Dudley. So he was very much hated. And so people are very, very willing to believe that Robert murdered his wife. And even if they don't truly believe it, they're very happy to repeat it.
And one of the powerful people that doesn't like him during this period is the restored Earl of Northumberland, Thomas Percy, who comes back into the story. He gets mentioned as a Knight of the Garter in the book and storms out of a meeting as a result of Robert Dudley. Can you tell us anything about what happened there? What caused him to have to storm out as a Knight of the Garter because of Dudley?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the Percy family at all, but I can talk a little bit about their relationship with the Dudleys at that point. The Percys have a lot of Catholic allegiances at that time. We're talking in the 1560s. In particular, he storms out in the company of Henry Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, who is a longtime Dudley foe. He's the one who heads up arresting John Dudley and is more than happy to do so. He is a Howard kin and part of this group of sort of Catholic-leaning conservatives at court who see the Dudleys as these noisome up-and-comers who have these very Protestant leanings, and there's this long intergenerational rivalry, particularly between the Howards and the Dudleys, but again, anyone who's affiliated with them or has that sort of perspective. And so Percy is part of that. And so anytime Robert Dudley gets a lift, for instance, becoming a member of the Order of the Garter, or installing any other Dudley family members or Dudley clientele into the order, or in any other positions, he's going to have a strop about it. And so he has this massive strop, essentially, and storms out in the company of Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, because of Robert's position in the order.
And it didn't work out too well for Percy, because by 1572 he had been beheaded. So
yes, yeah, for those Catholic leanings.
But the House of Dudley had more or less died out before the end of the Tudor period as well. Why do people still have so much interest in them so many centuries later? What is it about them? What did you find that kept your interest through years of researching and writing?
Yeah, wonderful question. They do essentially, that particular Dudley line ends in the technical sense of the last name. The two surviving sons, Ambrose and Robert, neither of them have legitimate children that survive past childhood. But their sister, Mary Dudley Sidney, does. And it's through the Sidneys that the Dudley line essentially continues to this day. If you get the chance to visit Penshurst, There's a lot of Dudley portraits and Dudley material at Penshurst because the Viscount de Lisle is still a Sidney from that line. But I think the fascination with them continues because they fulfill these almost quintessential roles in our telling of the Tudor story. We've got Edmund Dudley, who's this sort of evil, greedy minister, whispering in the ear of Henry VII. You've got John Dudley, who's more of a sort of militaristic man, but again, the evil Duke of Northumberland, who is conniving and scheming. And then you have Robert, who is more of the quintessential Renaissance courtier, but again is conniving and scheming and trying to win over Elizabeth. And so they are these villains, or they are presented as these villains. But what I tried to do was just sort of pan the camera out a little bit, and to understand what their wider place was. And importantly, how the intergenerational story changes our understanding of each of them. If we take, for instance, the death of Amy Robsart Dudley in 1560, the succession crisis with Lady Jane Grey Dudley had only happened 7 years before, right? Robert Dudley had been convicted of treason within that decade, and his brother and father had been executed for treason. So, which I think gets left out sometimes if we're thinking about Robert's place in the Elizabethan court. We have to understand what that does to people's perceptions of him, but also what that does to his perception of almost a sort of defensiveness, right? And what 2 generations, 3 generations of treason does to the person who has to carry that legacy. That was my attempt, and I think hopefully that's been successful. It's been really interesting. We've had 2 sort of mainstream presentations of the Dudleys since this book came out. One in the television show Becoming Elizabeth, and more recently in the show My Lady Jane. And I know that in one of those cases, my book did factor into how they presented the Dudleys, and that's with My Lady Jane. I don't know if it had anything to do with Becoming Elizabeth or not, but we are getting these more sort of well-rounded pictures of the Dudleys and understanding a bit more about their background and legacy, which is really exciting to me. I think, I don't want to come off like I'm on a mission to redeem them or anything. I am not, but I am on a mission as a historian to help us understand the complexity of the human experience in the past, which I think helps us understand the complexity of the human experience in our own lives today. And that there are no heroes or villains in the past. There are just complex people. I mean, maybe a few, but those are very, very exceptional, and aren't the Dudleys. So that's, I think, what I've been trying to do, and I think that has resonated.
When I read the book, it was definitely, you get this idea of the end of it is that because they got killed for treason, there must be a villain, but it's so much more than that. And also, they weren't the only family at that time using their own ambition and position to get themselves higher and higher in the court.
Absolutely. I've mentioned the Howards a few times. I mean, you've mentioned the Percys, right? You could write the same story about each of them. I mean, I usually use the Howards because they were such natural enemies to the Dudleys, and had very similar rises and falls, usually at opposite times of the Dudleys because they were fighting each other. And that was just the game of court. There's a fantastic letter from John Dudley right before the succession crisis, written actually to William Cecil when he's just a servant, essentially, of the Seymour and Dudley families, where he really reflects on what it is to serve in the court and what it is to serve a monarch. And he even talks about his father and what happened to his father, and that, his father died for his service to the crown. And, do I really want to do that? He's writing in the countryside. Do I want to go back to court and face all of that? And he decides in the end that he does, because he believes that service is so important, that it's his duty to do so. And I think that cultural context is important to keep in mind. Yes, there's ambition, but why? Right? Why are they ambitious? What is the motivation behind that. And I think it's a combination of a bare ambition, sure. There's a pun in there, bare, bare ambition. But I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of service and duty and being in a position to advance certain ideas and ideals. And I think some of it has to do with a sort of defensive protection of the family, that if you give up too much, once you're in there, once you're playing the game, you've got to win the game, because losing the game is no longer an option.
And if people want to find out more after hearing you now, the book is out, the book is available, they can dig into all of these things. But if they want to find out a little bit more about you or where to go next or what you might have coming up as your next project, where should people go?
Yes, thank you. I do have a new project. I will have a book coming out in the spring. It's not been formally announced yet, so I can't say too much about it, except that it's a biography of someone who does appear in the House of Dudley in a sort of minor capacity, but you will hear more soon. Thank you. But if they want to find out about that and other talks and things that I'm giving, I have a website, joannepaul.com. Nice and simple. I try to keep it as up to date as my schedule will allow. I am on some social media. I'm on Instagram and Threads at Dr Joanne Paul, and I hover around X / Twitter sometimes, but I'm less on there these days. But it's at Joanne _Paul_. Other than that, hopefully when the book is announced and comes out, you'll just be flooded with it from all sides.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
It was really interesting speaking all about the House of Dudley to Dr Joanne Paul, and the book is available now from all good bookshops.
For more Tudor-themed episodes of the Alnwick Castle podcast, head into our archive and look for episode 36, all about the Tudors, the Percys and Syon House, or try episode 65 for a conversation with Nicola Tallis on the young Elizabeth I.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. You can leave a review or rating on your podcast platform, or send us a message or a question on podcast@alnwickcastle.com.
We'll be back in 2 weeks to look at another part of history connected to Alnwick Castle. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.